Hi, I'm here with Ben Dowen, also known as the Full Snack Tester online. He is the creator of Tester of the Day and is a quality engineer at Ada Health. Today, we're going to have a wee chat about testing acceptance criteria or requirements. So, hello, Ben. Thanks for joining me.
Hello, Nicola. Very, very happy to be here.
So, you wanted to talk a bit about testing acceptance criteria. Should we start off with I'm thinking, what would be? Should we start off with on your current project? Do you have acceptance criteria or requirements to test against?
Okay, so on my current project, um, we often have some acceptance criteria, but those acceptance criteria will often be set by ourselves as the team. And normally there'll only be a small handful of the possible things that could be correct. So the requirements tend to be intentionally minimal rather than completionist. So there might be two or three acceptance criteria for a ticket if we have them for the current thing that I'm doing.
But
Yeah.
oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
So you're saying that they're intentionally minimal, as opposed to being quite complete. How do you find that, or what do you think about that?
So I don't see that as a particular barrier because although those acceptance criteria give us something to aim for, um, where I've worked in projects in the past, I've attempted to have complete acceptance criteria. It hasn't necessarily gained us much additional value in terms of things that we could test and the results that we get from that testing. By that, I mean that sometimes the acceptance criteria themselves can be a barrier because there's something else to maintain the state of, because it can be that you can invalidate those acceptance criteria very quickly.
And by
And I think
invalidate, you mean you realize that they're wrong and that they need to be updated?
exactly. So, for example, one of the brilliant things about testing is that you can help make design choices. Like as an agile team, as you're implementing a solution, you're still trying to solve the same problem. But if an acceptance criteria or requirement goes into so much detail that it mentions something in the implementation, then you lose the ability to make a better choice because all of a sudden you've committed to doing something in a certain way, and to be accepted it needs to exhibit that exact behavior. But it might be that because you solve the problem in a different way, if you change things to match exactly the acceptance criteria, you'd actually be making the implementation worse, which really is kind of a barrier. And then you've got to spend a fair amount of time making sure that that acceptance criteria stays up to date with every design choice you make.
You know, the weird thing of what you're saying to me makes me think about letter of the law and intent. So you're saying how you you want to build something that is good, but then if you the acceptance criteria itself can limit you, and in a weird way, it makes you think of the law. How there's the reason why something could have been written the way it is, but then it doesn't quite meet, or the way it's written and the intent aren't quite the same thing. So it's just a weird sort of outside experience that what you're saying triggers with me, or triggers within me, within me. Now, you said before how you've tested on projects where you've tried to go for a complete acceptance criteria, but then it hasn't really felt worth it. Was it? Well, did anything have to do with the time involved in making that happen? As a not just the fact that sometimes they were wrong, the resulting acceptance criteria, but was it a massive time investment to chase these down?
It was a huge time investment. So let me give you a really simple example of an acceptance criteria and a requirement that went too far.
Mm,
So we at a previous role, I was working on a bit of software that needed to display many results in a
mm,
table. I mean, this is kind of the kind of thing that might be very familiar to a lot of people. And one of the really exact requirements was that we needed a show more button. Okay. And we needed to show 10 things, and then we needed to show 10 more things every time you press the show more button.
Mm.
So we spent a fair amount of effort making a show more button that allowed you to show more things. But we hadn't taken any consideration how many rows of this table there would actually be when you had a representative amount of data. And the experience of pressing show more enough time to display all the data was painstakingly bad as an experience. And the time it took even to test, you could show all the data. If you did this by hand, it took like an hour to get a production level worth of data on the screen. Show more, show more, show more. So much so that to test it, I had to create some automation in the browser to repeatedly click the damn button
Mm.
in order to
So,
show all the data.
so was 10 just like an arbitrary number that sounded good? So like, let's just show 10 more. Like, was that, like, how did they come up with that number?
Yeah, it was an arbitrary number that was created, I think, somewhere between the business analyst and the client. And um, I think we didn't have any clear idea of the workflow of the end user and how much data there was likely to be. And we tested the acceptance criteria, and it could show 10 and it could show another 10. So it met the acceptance criteria beautifully. It did exactly as was requested. Um, and this is just a really good example of how, because what they gave us was a requirement based on the implementation, not a requirement based off the problem that was trying to be solved. And we just went and met it exactly as we were asked, but we failed because we didn't meet the quality that we wanted to hit. We didn't allow the user an experience that was in any way acceptable, but we sure met that requirement.
Yeah, but you're saying how the requirement, or I can't remember the quite word you use, was based on the implementation. It's like, have you seen this thing online where you have like a arrow and then you draw a circle around it?
An
So
arrow
it's
with a
like
circle
it's
around it.
like you've hit the it's not like you've hit the target. You shoot an arrow somewhere, and then you draw a circle. I'm like, yes, that's I achieved my goal. Look, as opposed to having drawing the target first and then shooting the arrow at the target. It's like a reverse sort of reverse order. So in this case, the implementation. Now I'm getting mixed up with this analogy. The implementation is the arrow, which is first, and then the requirements or the acceptance criteria is the target. So in theory, you should have a target first, and then you shoot an arrow. But what you described seems to be the other way around.
I mean, in fairness, we had a target and the target was wrong. And what this really is an example of is that if you test the acceptance criteria alone, you can only possibly test the explicit requirements.
Mm,
And this is something I know you've spoken about as well,
mm,
that the explicit requirements can only possibly include the things you imagine before you start building.
mm, mm.
And that inherently limits you. And it comes back to something that I've realized recently, and that is that fundamentally, the goal of doing good testing and the goal of doing good quality engineering, like the thing you're aiming for, isn't to do really good testing. It isn't to create really clever tests, and it isn't to use all the latest techniques. The goal is to work with your team to build a better product. Like, the goal isn't the testing. The testing is a tool you're using to help your team get to building the right thing. And the acceptance criteria could potentially help you get there, but they're not all of what you need to get there. So you're going to miss things. If you over focus and only focus your testing on the acceptance criteria or the requirements alone, and you forget to ask why, you miss the opportunity to make better software. You miss the
Have
opportunity to help your users achieve their actual desired goal.
Have you worked with people who try to test only against the acceptance criteria? And how have did you try to speak to them about a different way of doing things?
So that's a really good question. I've definitely worked in places where testing against the acceptance criteria was completely what was expected.
Mm,
And I'll be the first to admit, I mean, I've been working in testing now for about 10 years. I've done testing where I've only focused on the acceptance criteria, and I've
mm.
missed things, right? So I've been that person doing that level of basic testing and missing things. Um, have I spoken to people about this? I'm starting to now. So this is my realization more recently that this is a really important thing to mention. I've been doing learning by consuming great work from other people. There's a great blog by Callum Akers Ryan on why testing acceptance criteria isn't enough.
I'll include
That's
that
a
in the
really great.
description. Yep.
It's a great blog, and it really resonated with me because I was like, "Yeah, that's not enough. I know that that's not enough. I've done it, and it wasn't enough."
Mm, mm. Because you're saying also that with explicit requirements, you're counting on people thinking about all these things in advance, which is, I mean, at least in my experience, I don't haven't seen anyone who has been able to do that, or any group of people who've been able to do that, because you can make an effort to have discussions and um, meetings and all that, and you can nail out a lot of requirements in advance. But there's an act of building, of starting that journey together, that triggers something in your mind to think, oh gosh, we didn't think of that. When you start to um, integrate your back end and front end, you're like, oh, we didn't think of that either. And that's you can't prevent something that you didn't think of in the first place, or you can't implement something that you didn't think of in the first place.
And ultimately, this is where exploratory testing is so powerful because you can use it to help find things you haven't thought of ahead of time. You can use it to help make design decisions. And then when you've made those design decisions as a team, you can then try them out. You can run experiments. And that kind of more experiment driven testing and development has the opportunity to lead you to a better result.
Mm.
So far, in my experience.
Since you brought up exploratory testing, I want to go on a slight tangent.
Mhm.
What's your approach? Does your approach differ between how you test acceptance or criteria versus how you test when you don't have acceptance criteria or those gaps? So, for example, you're saying when you don't know what to expect, then you're doing exploratory testing.
Mhm.
Do you also do exploratory testing when you're testing to ensure the acceptance criteria has been met?
That's a really good question. And most of the exploratory testing I do is not focused on the acceptance criteria, but it might be focused on some other Oracle or some other analysis work. So, for example, I've recently been doing some of the risk storming sessions. And in that, we might identify quality aspects. And these are things could be performance, scalability, and those kind of requirements that often don't get thought about early on. But they could also be something like maintainability, right? And when I'm testing that's more focused on a quality aspect in terms of exploratory testing, this could be very, very different to an acceptance criteria. Because an acceptance criteria, like typically the ones that I've seen, are usually the end product has exactly this thing. It has this button. The user can achieve exactly this action. Now, when I'm testing something like a quality aspect for maintainability, I ask a lot of what if questions. Okay, what if we were asked to suddenly make this feature multi-tenant? Okay, what are our current blockers from a maintainability point of view for going to multi-tenant? And then I start kind of thinking about the possibilities of where we could go and then work that back to, okay, are there anything is there anything we're doing now that stops us from being able to meet that goal? And none of that would come from an acceptance criteria in terms of you might get something vague like, oh, you need to be scalable. It's like, cool. How far do you need to scale? What happens when you need to scale? Um, Having said that, I'm pretty sure you could do exploratory testing around acceptance criteria or using acceptance criteria for inspiration. I don't see why not.
Yeah. Like, when it's come to you said quality aspects that go beyond like just the standard acceptance criteria, I haven't seen many that are super concrete, which uh, as I understand it, good, I think the term is like good requirements should be measurable, or they need to be objective. They shouldn't be open to interpretation. And as you said, scalable is something that, if you don't know what you're scaling to, or like exactly how many users you need to support at some point or whatever, then it's useless is such a mean word. Essentially useless. Is that any better? But yeah, um, you, we're running low on time. Aside from Callum's blog post on testing against acceptance criteria is not enough, are there any other resources? Like if someone is hearing, like is listening to this and they're or watching, and they're thinking, I'd like to learn more about testing within the gaps or not testing like just the acceptance criteria. What advice would you give to such people?
Okay, so the first one is I'd introduce them to the concept of heuristics. And heuristics are these rules of thumb, often mnemonics, that help remind us um, things that we might otherwise forget that are, could be true of our software. These are like great cheat codes, and there's a brilliant heuristic cheat sheet that's recently been posted on the Ministry of Testing by Simon Tomes, which gathers together actually a lot of material from other sources like Elizabeth Hendrickson's Explore It work and other kind of heuristics and mnemonics from around the industry. And that's a really good place to kind of go for inspiration. And then there's also the risk storming and the risk storming online, which are the test sphere cards, which help you kind of, again, these quality aspects are really heuristics for ways to think about the product, which are more than the individual acceptance criteria that you might see in your requirements.
Sweet. Thanks, Hughes, for sharing those. If someone wanted to find you online, where should I point them to?
Okay, so I'm at Full Snack Tester on Twitter. You can find me Dowen B on LinkedIn, or you can go over to dowen.me.uk and read my blog.
Sweet. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me. Have a good afternoon.
You too.